Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. It's Tuesday morning, November 2nd, 2021. Good to see folks joining on the stream today. We're going to start today in Ezekiel Chapter 8, and we'll see how far we get. Good morning, Brian. Good to see you. Good morning, Lyle, Diana, Gail. We're also live on the Near Churches page. Good morning, Linda. Good to see you. Well, like I said, we're gonna start in Ezekiel chapter 8. My plan is, and we'll see how it goes, we're gonna cover Ezekiel chapters 8 through 11, and the reason is because it's all covering the exact same. It's the same context, and so I'm not gonna read every verse. We're going to kind of break it down into sections, but it's all talking about the same events, and particularly the judgment that's coming upon God's people because of their continued spiritual adultery. That's the way it's described here by Ezekiel, so that is the plan for today. As always, if you have any questions or comments as we're going through the text, feel free to use the comment section here, and I will acknowledge them when I see them. There are the Owsleys. Good to see you guys on here today. Barry and Glenda, good morning. All right, guys. We'll get started with Ezekiel chapter 8. And so this chapter here is, let me see real quick, 18 verses long. Not terribly long, but what we're dealing with here is basically, as you read Ezekiel chapter 8, is it's like abomination upon abomination. It's like sin is stacked up in Jerusalem, basically. And I touched a bit on that yesterday with when you go back to the end of 2 Kings, really chapters 24 and 25, the end of 2 Chronicles, you see those kings that I guess they were in power as the nation of Judah was coming to an end. And in particular, one stands out during that period of time, and that is Manasseh. So all of these prophecies that we're talking about, the abomination upon abomination, sin stacked on sin, is within that historical context of those final few kings. So when you go back there, I'll just turn back there real quick since I mentioned it. Okay, so 2 Chronicles 33 records Manasseh, and also 2 Kings chapter 21. So those would be your parallel accounts. Very wicked man, and he reigned for 55 years. Well, after Manasseh, you have Ammon. Ammon's wicked. After Ammon, you have Josiah. Now, it's kind of crazy to think about for me, but Josiah is one of the best kings, if you want to term it that way, one of the best kings that Judah had, and he's the grandson of one of the worst kings that Judah ever had. And so within 2 generations, you go from extreme wickedness to a complete effort at reformation and getting back to the book of the law. And so then you get to 2 Chronicles 36, and you have Jehoahaz. 2 Chronicles 36, beginning in verse 1, he was evil. You have Jehoiakim, he was evil. You have Jehoiachin, he was evil. Zedekiah, he was evil. And so the endings of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles record all of this transition during those final years, if you will, of the nation of southern Israel, Judah. That's the context here that Ezekiel's writing in. Remember, Ezekiel has already been taken captive. I see some more folks have joined on. Good morning, Sheila. Anil from India, good morning. Shirley in Texas, good to see you. Anna, I know you're over there near Reelfoot Lake, Tennessee. Glad y'all are here today. All right, so that's the historical setting of what Ezekiel's dealing with. And remember, Ezekiel is parallel with Daniel and Jeremiah, and so written from different perspectives. And there's Michelle. Good morning, Michelle. And so it's good to know all of that, to be able to make those historical connections and textual connections throughout the Bible. And Ezekiel's writing during this time, and it's sin upon sin, and he actually dates this particular prophecy, if you will, or revelation, let's say, in Acts chapter, in Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 1, it came to pass in the 6th year and the 6th month. Well, he's talking about the year of the 6th year and the 6th month of, as he describes it back in chapter 1 in the first couple of verses, of Jehoiachin's captivity. So we're looking then approximately at 590 BC, 591 BC, somewhere in that period of time, he is brought in to see visions of God. And remember, he is in exile. He is in Babylon, like, again, Daniel and his friends and things like this. Jeremiah is back in Jerusalem, okay? So you have these different pictures from different perspectives, and it's good to be able to connect all of that, or at least to have that knowledge, okay? These books were not written in a vacuum all by themselves. They have contemporaries, and they're writing perhaps to somewhat different audiences, but in essence to the same audience, because it's to God's people, but they're in different locations and perhaps to some extent dealing with different things. So that's what Ezekiel does here in chapter 8. Good morning, Clyde, over on the Near Churches page. Glad to have you today. And it's like things just, as they stack up here in chapter 8, it gets worse and worse. One of the first things that's pointed out here in chapter 8 is he's brought in visions of God to Jerusalem. So he's in Babylon, but he's, as it says, the Spirit picked him up by a lock of his hair and suspended him between heaven and earth. And so he's having a vision of what's going on in Jerusalem. But he, Ezekiel himself, is in Babylonian captivity by the river Kibar. One of the first things that he's shown here as he's able to see the visions of Jerusalem is this image of jealousy in the first 5 verses. And it's set up, and we're not told what this image is. It's just called the image of jealousy. We know it's connected with the idolatry that the Israelites had begun practicing. You can read 2 Kings 21 and the first 7 verses. Again, that's the reign of Manasseh and how he set up idols in the temple of God. And that's probably what we're dealing with here, is this historical propensity of God's people to worship idols. And so Ezekiel's brought to see this. And it's sin after sin. It's sin stacked upon sin. And as you keep reading the text here of Ezekiel chapter 8, he'll tell him to lift his eyes, look up at this. Okay, for instance, verse 5. Lift up your eyes towards the north. So I did that, and I saw the image of jealousy in the entrance. The idol-worshiping habits of the Jewish people, even in the temple of God. And again, you can read that in 2 Kings 21 with Manasseh. You can go down to beginning in verses 6 down through verse 8. He talks about greater abominations in the sanctuary. Verses 9 through 12, the practice again among God's own people of worshiping. Notice verse 10. Every sort of creeping thing, abominable beast, and the idols of the house of Israel portrayed all around on the walls. Ezekiel, while he's given this image of the temple, you have the temple structure, but then around it you have the court that's walled off. Well, he's told to dig into these walls and see what's going on, as we might say today, behind the scenes. And it seems that the elders of Israel they've convinced themselves that God can't see what they're doing. And that comes out in chapter 8. And in fact, if you look at verse 12, God speaks to Ezekiel and says, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark, every man in the room of his idols? For they say, the Lord does not see us, the Lord has forsaken the land. And again, that's in the midst of the historical context of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians having come and started the process of deporting captives and killing people and things like this. And so they've convinced themselves that, well, God's left us. And in fact, not yet, he hasn't. Ezekiel's going to see a vision about that. Then you get to Ezekiel 8, verses 13 and 14, and they're worshiping Tamas. Now, this is the only time that this particular god is mentioned in Scripture, Tamas. And you do a little digging on that, and this is the Sumerian god of fertility. Again, it's just it's the continued practices of idolatry among God's own people. greater abominations, verse 15. So now he's in the inner court of the Lord's house, and there at the door of the temple between the porch and the altar. 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the sun. They're worshiping the sun. Well, they've adopted the captivity, the idolatry from the people around them. And the Jews are practicing this idolatry. You notice in Ezekiel 8 and verse 17 there, it says, "For they have filled the land with violence, then they have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose." They put the branch to their nose is an interesting phrase. One of the beliefs was of the worship of the sun among the Sumerians, apparently, was when you would look toward the sun to worship it, you would have to cover your nose and mouth so that your breath wouldn't pollute the divine nature of the sun. Well, the Israelites are doing that very same thing. And so God, verse 18, is going to act in his fury. And what then chapter 9 does is God separates the wicked from the righteous. Ezekiel in chapter 9 is given a vision of 7 men. There are 6 men, they have their swords drawn. And then there's another man who's dressed in linen, and he has an inkhorn. He's going to write something, or he's going to mark something. And that's recorded in Ezekiel chapter 9, verses 3 and 4. God's bringing judgment. But what he does here in Ezekiel chapter 9 is he makes a difference between the wicked and the righteous, or as Ezekiel's going to term it, the remnant. So for instance, look at Ezekiel 9 and verse 4. The man dressed in linen who is set apart from these 6 other individuals, he says, "Go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and who cry over all the abominations that are done within it." So, like for instance, in the margin of my Bible there, I wrote 2 Timothy 2:19, "The Lord knows those who are his." And you could look at Revelation 7 and Revelation chapter 14, this concept of God marking his people. God knows. God recognizes those who are faithful to him, even in the midst of abomination upon abomination. Those who have obeyed the gospel are marked. That is, they're set apart. They're sanctified, if you want to use a New Testament word. Well, that's what chapter 9 does. God's fury is coming, chapter 8, verse 18, but the wicked and the righteous, there's going to be an identification made. Now again, remember, Ezekiel's seeing a vision here. There's not literally a mark on these people's bodies, on their foreheads specifically, Ezekiel 9 and verse 4. And that's the same thing with the book of Revelation. People talk about the mark of the beast and all of this, and they want to try to make a spiritual or a figurative language context literal. That's not what's going on here. The concept is God knows those who are his. They're set apart for him. And so they are identified here in chapter 9. And when you get down to verse 9 in chapter 9, it says, "The iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great, and the land is full of bloodshed, and the city is full of perversity. For they say, the Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see." Well, the fact of the matter is, God had not forsaken his people, and God could see. He knew exactly what was going on. And that's why this difference is made between those who cried and who were truly bothered by the idolatry and those who were not. Because what's going to happen then in chapter 10 is we're brought back in Ezekiel chapter 10 to the scene of Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel is given in chapter 10 another vision, let's say, of God himself and of that chariot. You remember the chariot from chapter 1, the 4 cherubs and the wheels within the wheels, and they each had 4 faces, and they moved in direction wherever the Spirit determined. Well, that was representative of God's presence. God was with his people, even in their captivity in a foreign land. He knew what was going on there, but he also knew what was going on in Jerusalem. God's omniscience is what's being pictured in chapter 10. And so what happens in chapter 10, chapter 9, the righteous, the remnant, we'll use Ezekiel's word, the remnant has been marked. They're noted. Chapter 10, the image is that Jerusalem is burned. They take coals from this chariot that represents God's presence, and they scatter it over the city of Jerusalem. It's going to be burned. Remember, when Ezekiel starts his prophecy back there in chapter 1, it's in the 5th year of Jehoiakim's captivity, which is about 592 BC. Okay? The final time that Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon comes up against Jerusalem and essentially burn the city to the ground is about 10 years after that, about 586 BC. So what we're reading here in chapters 8 through 11 is looking just a few years into the future of what's going to happen to the city of Jerusalem. It's going to be burned. And that's exactly what happened, but Ezekiel's given quite a spectacular view of how that's going to happen, let's say. And it's also in this chapter. So the leadership of Israel, again, as you read chapters 8 and specifically chapter 8, they had convinced themselves that God had forsaken them and that he was no longer there. And so that's why they're in the inner court of the temple worshiping these idols, and they're doing it in secret places. They have rooms set up for their idols, and they're worshiping the sun and all these things. Well, they've convinced themselves that God's departed from the land. Well, chapter 10 shows us that, yes, he's going to depart from the land. He's going to remove his glory from the temple as it's portrayed here. But it's going to come. It's going to come when the city's burned. And they enter that 70 years of captivity. And, man, Ezekiel talks about that. Daniel talks about that. Jeremiah talks about that. It's recorded time and time again by multiple prophets that this is what's going to happen. But what Ezekiel 10 does for us is show us, again, God's omnipresence, his omniscience. He knows all things. He sees all things. And he's bringing judgment against his people, and the city's going to be burned. And then you look at Ezekiel 10:18, it says, "Then the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim." God's withdrawing himself from this place. Now again, they thought that had already happened, but, well, I guess you could say it's in the present. It was in the process of happening because of their continued sin. So then there in Ezekiel chapter 10 and verse 20, it says, "This is the living creature I saw under the God of Israel by the river Kibar, and I know, and I knew they were cherubim." Well, that he's saying, this is what I talked about in chapter 1. And so it's the same thing. Sheila says the faithful remnant fell under the punishment too. They did. They suffered. And that's, you think about it. Ezekiel is in captivity. All right. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, probably better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were all in captivity. All right. They suffered, yes. But what the key is about the remnant, and chapter 11 talks about this, the key about the remnant is they're going to return. They're coming back to the land. And so chapter 10 records the burning of Jerusalem and the glory of the Lord departing from the temple. And then chapter 11, the first part of chapter 11, it continues discussing the judgment that comes upon wickedness. And specifically here in chapter 11, the judgment that's going to come upon false prophets. A good thing to do with Ezekiel 11 is read Jeremiah chapters 28 and 29. Because again, these guys are contemporary. They're talking about the same stuff that's going on. So, look at Ezekiel 11, verse 2. It says, "And he said to me, Son of man, these are the men who devise iniquity and give wicked counsel in this city, who say the time is not near to build houses. This city is the cauldron, and we are the meat." Jeremiah dealt with that very specifically. If you go back and read Jeremiah chapter 29 and 28 as well, there was a false prophet that Jeremiah had to deal with by the name of Hananiah. And Hananiah was going around and telling the people, listen, don't build houses. Don't get ready to stay in captivity for a long time because it's only going to last for 2 years. Well, Jeremiah dealt with that. You read Jeremiah 29, and he says, no, the word of the Lord is, you're going to be there for 70 years. So build houses, plant vineyards. You be ready to stay there because you're going to be there for 70 years. And so this judgment that's pronounced upon Jerusalem in Ezekiel chapter 10 is more now specifically targeted at the false prophets and the evil counselors that are trying to deceive the people to whom Ezekiel was prophesying. And so, prophesy against them, Son of Man, Ezekiel chapter 11 and verse 4. And then again, it talks about the multiplication of sin. You look at Ezekiel 11 and verse 6. You have multiplied your slain in the city. You have filled it with its streets with the slain. And remember what I think it was yesterday, I told you about Manasseh. One of the sins of Manasseh was that he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood from one end to the other. So it's a city of idolatry. It's a city of violence and injustice. And Jerusalem's going to be judged. Diana says that's where I was talking about people's sin has consequences for the whole lot. The good with the bad to suffer in this world. Absolutely. There are, and we may suffer with the consequences of the sins of others, but that's a whole nother story from suffering the guilt of the sins of others. Each man is guilty for his own sins, and that's one of Ezekiel's primary messages, but certainly the righteous can suffer the consequences of the sins of the wicked. There's no doubt about that. So Ezekiel 11, 1 through 13, judgments coming specifically upon the false the false prophets, the evil counselors, sin upon sin upon sin. But then when you get to chapter 11 and verse 14, you have the promise given to those who are what we would refer to as the remnant. Okay, there's going to be a restoration to the land, and that's where chapter 11 ends, down through verse 25 there. While they will suffer in the captivity, there is hope. So, for instance, you look at chapter 11, verse 16, beginning, "Therefore say," this is what God is telling Ezekiel to prophesy, "Thus says the Lord God, although I have cast them far off among the Gentiles," that's the captivity, "and although I have scattered them among the countries, yet I shall be a little sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone." And so, again, God is with his people even if they're not in Jerusalem. And then, verse 17, "I will gather you from the peoples, assemble you from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel." Well, read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's exactly what happened specifically prophesied under Cyrus, the king of Persia. Daniel records that. In fact, when you read Daniel chapter 9, Daniel's in captivity, and he tells us, he says, "Listen, I was reading the book of Jeremiah, and I learned that the 70 years were about up." So it's so interesting to me that you have a prophet reading the books of other prophets and being able to recognize that the 70 years in Babylon was almost up, and they're going to return to the land. And that's exactly what Ezekiel says here. There will be a restoration to the land. And what's going to happen, once Israel gets back to the land, the remnant, from this 70 years of captivity, verse 18, "They will go there and they will take away all its detestable things and all its abominations from there." They will never have another problem with idolatry like they did before, once the captivity's over. That's going to be something that's done. They're going to have a new heart and one heart and a new spirit, verse 19. The spirit there in verse 19 is not a reference to the Holy Spirit. They're going to have a new spirit within them. They're going to have a different mindset. Once the 70 years of captivity is over, their mind is going to change. They're not going to be so hard-hearted. Notice there in verse 19, the stony heart, they're going to have a heart of flesh. Remember, that's back in the early chapters, God told Ezekiel, "They're hard-headed, I've made you more hard-headed." But after captivity, the remnant, those who are able to return to the land, they're going to be different. That captivity is going to have changed them. But then you look at verse 21. "But as for those whose hearts follow the desire for their detestable things and their abominations, I will recompense their deeds on their own heads." So this remnant is faithful, but there would even be some among the remnant who would still cling to sin, and God would deal with that. Well, then the Lord is lifted high above, and the glory of the God of Israel was high above, verse 22, and the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain which is on the east side of the city. So you have this imagery of the presence of God leaving, departing from Jerusalem. Remember, that's the vision that Ezekiel was given, chapter 8 and verses 1 and 2. Well, then the Spirit took me up and brought me in a vision by the Spirit of God into Chaldea to those in captivity, and the vision that I had seen went up from me. So I spoke to those in captivity of all the things the Lord had shown me. And that's what we just read in chapters 8 through 11. That's what he then speaks to the people of Israel. The city's going to be burned. You're going into captivity, but there's going to be a remnant who returns. And so I know chapters 8 through 11, I know that's a lot of content, but it's all talking about the same thing. The sin upon sin of Israel, the punishment, the burning of the city, but then the promise that God would still be with his people and would bring them back to the land after the captivity was over. So hopefully you can get something from that. I don't see any further questions or comments on either page, but I'm glad you were here today. And once the stream's over, if you do have any questions or comments, you can still access the comment section here, and I will acknowledge them when I see them. So that's it for today. We're going to look at probably tomorrow Ezekiel chapters 12 and 13 because there's more captivity language discussed, and so that'll be the plan for tomorrow. But I appreciate you guys being on here today, and hope to see you back here tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and we'll start in Ezekiel chapter 12. So have a good day.